Hi, welcome to week 2 of the ASEP book study on high leverage practices for inclusive classrooms. I'm Christina Rivera. I am the program director for the Deaf Hard of Hearing Special Education program at the University of Arizona, and I'm looking forward to spending this week with you. As a reminder, these are the outcomes we hope for by the end of these 5 weeks that we're spending together. We'd like for you all to become familiar or more familiar with the HLPs. We'd like to support you in embedding HLPs throughout your program and in your courses, help you to locate HLP resources, and give you this opportunity to network with peers and colleagues from other IHEs in the state. Again, as a reminder, these are the participation guidelines. You've already done number 1 and number 2, right? You've got the book, you've registered for EdWeb, you've already accessed week 1, now you're accessing week 2. So we'll continue expecting you to respond to prompts, the initial prompt, and responding to at least 2 other participants within the discussion board. But I think also kind of hoping that we'll make this discussion a little more authentic than some discussion boards can be. So don't limit yourself to responding to just 2 other participants. Respond to as many as you'd like. Carry on a conversation with each other within the discussion boards. And then, of course, consider adding HLP resources to the resource file, okay? Even if you're not adding resources to this folder, check on it once in a while, check in, and there might be stuff there that you never even knew that you wanted as far as resources for HLPs. So check on the folder at least once a week, I'd say, by the end of the week. Okay, today's topic is assessment. We're going to be taking a closer look at assessment, and those are HLPs 4, 5, and 6. I'm going to give a brief description of the general assessment category, followed by a more detailed description of each HLP within the assessment category. After that, I'd like you to consider how you currently teach assessment and what modifications you might need to make within your program or courses to align better with the HLPs. And then I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of reflection. Okay, so assessment. Oftentimes in special education, we're always thinking about remediation, and we're thinking about how best to support students and what their needs are. And that is one purpose of assessment. But it's important to remember that assessment also serves for us to find out what students' strengths are, right? And help us to dig deeper into understanding that student as far as their ability level, what they're interested in, what the family assets are as far as, what we can leverage to support students as much as possible within the context of their family, within the context of their culture. So assessment really serves the purpose of creating a comprehensive student profile that highlights not just their areas of need, but also their strengths. Because my area of expertise is deafness, the examples I'm going to give today are specific to my field. And so, one of the things that we like to talk about in my field is the concept of deaf gain, and thinking about not just what an individual is losing because they can't hear at the same level as is typical, but what do they gain from being deaf, right? What are the benefits of being deaf? One of those benefits is typically belonging to the deaf community, which is a whole separate culture from the hearing community. So not thinking just about the deficits, right? Not looking at students from that deficit model, but looking at them through the lens of assets and how their disability makes them unique and support that individuality in each student in accordance with their identity as a person with a disability or a member of a certain disability group. So assessment can help us do all of that, okay? So long as we are administering and collecting data from a wide variety of assessment sources. So that can include, you know, what a lot of folks think of as assessment or evaluation. Often the first thing that comes to our heads are you know, standardized assessments, things like the Woodcock-Johnson or the Wyatt, or like the expressive one-word picture vocabulary. Those are absolutely part of what we're talking about. But we're also talking about collecting data off of, like, you know, classroom observations or curriculum-based measures, or, you know, student or parent questionnaires, student interest inventories. All of that is important when we're trying to, again, trying to collect information to create a comprehensive learner profile about the student's strengths and areas of need. When we're thinking about those types of assessments, any type of assessment really, it's important that the person administering assessments be familiar with the student. For most students, that is probably the classroom teacher or the special education teacher, someone who provides services. But it's important that that person be familiar with the student, but also be familiar with the disability area and can provide the appropriate accommodations or modifications that are needed for the student to give the best that they can during that assessment period. So, you know, in my case, again, that might mean somebody who is fluent in American Sign Language, and making sure that that person implements appropriate modifications to an assessment so that it doesn't invalidate the results, but also gives the student the best opportunities to demonstrate what they can and can't do. So before we move on to the next slide, I want you to take a moment and think about, in your own practice, back when you were a teacher, or if you're teaching now, or even within the context of your classes, of your courses, think about a time when you felt really good about the assessment you administered, or you felt really good about your choice of assessments for the particular student, something good related to assessment. But then also I'd like you to think about a situation or a student that, if you could go back and do something different related to their 3-year reevaluation, or maybe it was a classroom level assessment, if you could go back and do something different, I'd like you just to think about that kid or think about that assessment for a little while. You can go ahead and pause this video if you'd like to jot those thoughts down, or just be thinking about them, but go ahead and pause if you'd like here to jot that down. Okay, so the first high leverage practice within the assessment category is HLP number 4, and that's using multiple sources of information to develop a comprehensive understanding of a student's strengths and weaknesses. Okay, again, we want to develop a comprehensive learner profile that provides an in-depth understanding of the student's strengths, their areas of needs, their interests, and understanding the home context. All right. To develop this profile, we need teachers who are skilled in collecting, interpreting, and synthesizing the information from a variety of assessments, right? So formal and informal assessments, so standardized assessments, norm referenced assessments, but also sources, like I mentioned before, curriculum-based measures, classroom observations are really valuable. Student surveys, interest inventories, parent questionnaires, all are important. We have to take into account the sociocultural identity of the family of the student. Even when we're choosing assessments, we know that there are a lot of norm referenced assessments that are not culturally sensitive, right? That show some bias. I think that assessment creators like Pearson and folks like that, they've gotten better at being aware of the issues that come up within assessments that are show cultural bias, and kind of, you know, are unfair for students who are not of the majority culture. So we want to be careful when we're choosing assessments, that we're choosing assessments that are appropriate for the student. If the student is an English language learner, we have to think, okay, should I, if it's a, you know, if they come from a Spanish speaking home, you know, the Woodcock-Johnson exists in Spanish. There are Spanish versions of various assessments. If we really want to know what that student's abilities are, it's best to give the assessments in the language that they are most familiar. And again, that goes back to making sure that we are having somebody who is familiar with the student, who can speak the language fluently, and not just at a conversational level, but at a level that is needed to administer the assessment appropriately. At the classroom level, when we're talking about assessment, we want to make sure that we're supporting teacher candidates to choose assessments that are appropriate, and providing them with ways to create or to choose alternate assessments, giving students different ways to demonstrate their knowledge, so that they're not impacted by the format of the test, that they're truly able to demonstrate their knowledge. Again, an example from my field, you know, deaf and hard of hearing students, many of them, especially those who American Sign Language is their primary language, written English isn't always a strong suit, right? That's typically an area that needs support for deaf and hard of hearing students. So if I want to assess a deaf student's ability to explain the, you know, the causes of the Civil War, it's okay for me to provide that student with an alternate assessment of signing, of creating a video that gives them that opportunity to express that information through their native language, rather than forcing them to write it down on a test or in an essay or something like that. If I know that they're going to struggle with writing, but they know the content, is this an assessment of their writing or an assessment of their content knowledge? All right. So we want to consider alternate assessments as much as possible for all assessments, but it's particularly easier to do at the classroom level. All right. The next HLP is interpreting and communicating assessment information with stakeholders to collaboratively design and implement educational programs. So who are the stakeholders? We know parents are the stakeholders. We know general education teachers, special education teachers, could be the principal. You know, pretty much the family gets to decide who they want as part of the team, right? Who the stakeholders are. Could be grandparents, could be aunts, could be uncles. It really is kind of up to the family to decide who they want included. They may want the PE teacher there or the football coach, right? So we want to make sure that the team includes all of the stakeholders who participate according to the student needs. The team cannot make student-centered decisions unless they understand the assessment results. And so the person who administered the assessments is likely the person who is going to interpret those assessment results. And we want to make sure that we are interpreting them and explaining the results in a way that each stakeholder can understand. And that might mean, you know, providing them with specific examples of what does this look like, at football practice? What does this look like at home? To help them better understand those assessment results and how it relates to the way that they interact with that student or the way they relate to that student. So it's important that the person communicating the results is familiar with the audience, they know the audience, they can adapt their explanations according to the audience. You know, for example, describing assessment results to parents at a parent-teacher conference is probably different than how you would present the results to an entire IEP team. While presenting and communicating the results, it's important that we check in with the audience to make sure that they're engaged, make sure that they are understanding. And I think it's important for teacher candidates to keep in mind that a lot of parents, many parents, not all, can feel intimidated by IEP meetings. They might shut down at IEP meetings. They might just kind of, give in to what the professionals think. But it's important that we make that effort to make parents feel included and keep them engaged. And finally, the last HLP in this area, number 6, is using student assessment data, analyzing instructional practices, and making necessary adjustments that improve student outcomes. So this graphic I took straight out of this chapter related to this HLP. And this is the data-based instruction cycle. And that's really what this particular HLP is all about. We know that when teachers use data to make instructional decisions, student outcomes are better. Okay, when teachers look at data before they make instructional decisions, they more frequently will make appropriate decisions. Rather than just kind of finding something fun to do with the kids, they're using data to drive the decision and using data to make that activity a little more intentional and teaching it in a way that that students can really benefit from in the long run. Curriculum-based measures are one very important and realistic way that teacher candidates and practicing teachers can use to detect small gains in student progress. And I know in my field, it's very hard for our students, especially those students who are particularly language deprived and language delayed, to make that 1 year's progress in 1 year's time. That's quite difficult for many of our deaf students, but it is still possible to for them to make gains, for them to demonstrate that they have learned, they've learned a particular set of vocabulary words, none of which are on the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test. So they may not show gains on that standardized test, but they can show gains on a curriculum-based measure that is based on a particular set of targeted vocabulary words. So teacher candidates should be learning about curriculum-based measures. They should be learning about progress monitoring. And also, as with any assessments, we want to make sure that they know what the proper accommodations are for any assessment. We want to make sure that instructional material appropriately scaffolds from the assessment results, from what the student knows, scaffolding up to where we want them to be. Okay, so how do we get our teacher candidates from the theories, kind of the general ideas of what I've shared right now about these assessment high leverage practices, to actually practice them? Okay, so I'm going to share with you some of what I do in my program and in my courses that infuses these high leverage practices. Okay, so HLP number 4, using multiple sources. So for my students in their methods courses, they have a language early intervention and language development methods course, and a literacy assessment and intervention. So for example, in the language course, it's really called language assessment and intervention. So the focus really is on assessment. So in that class, they are introduced to a variety of assessments that they can use for determining the language level of their deaf and hard of hearing students. I introduced them to standardized assessments like the expressive one word. I introduced them to language samples and the benefits of collecting language samples. But beyond that, they get practice opportunities within the course. They are required to collect a language sample and administer a vocabulary assessment like the expressive one word. They're required to do that. And the whole purpose of that really is just to give them practice collecting the language sample, administering the assessment. They don't even have to use a deaf and hard of hearing student for the purpose of those assignments. They can use their own kid. They can use a niece, a nephew. They can use a kid of a friend. It doesn't matter, because the purpose of the assignment is to give my students, my teacher candidates, the opportunity to practice collecting. And one of the things I found that is most impactful for these assignments is the logistics of administering a vocabulary assessment. How do you set up how should the table be arranged so that you can, fluently and skillfully administer this assessment without having to take a break to collect your data or without having an impact on student outcomes. So the logistics of implementing assessment, I have found, is what's most beneficial by these practice learning opportunities that I give my students in these classes. In their field experiences, of course, they get to actually apply what they practiced in their methods courses, and they get to apply that with an actual deaf and hard of hearing student that they work with throughout their practicum experience. Our students have 2 field experiences. One is a practicum where they're working one-on-one with a deaf hard of hearing student, and the other is their full-time student teaching capstone internship. All right, so HLP4, interpret results for stakeholders, communicate results to the stakeholders. As a culminating activity in the practicum that my students have, they are required to participate in a mock parent meeting. So they will meet one-on-one with one of the supervisors who are also coaches. We've adopted a coaching model for our practicum, and so supervisors also serve as coaches. So they will set up a meeting with one of the supervisors who is not their immediate supervisor. So someone they're really unfamiliar with, who they haven't really shared much with. And they run a mock parent meeting where they share some assessment results, not all of the assessment results, because that would, of course, take a very long time. So they choose a couple of the assessments and they present those assessments as if they were presenting to a parent. And so in that way, it's another practice learning opportunity for them in a situation that is not high stakes. They get to practice. We have them upload the video to GoReact, and we provide feedback within GoReact about their presentation, tips on how to improve, and hopefully that at least helps them get like the butterflies out, so that when they get to a real life situation where they actually have to share this with a real parent, they're not as nervous about it. And then using data-based instruction, making data-based instructional decisions, that is kind of embedded throughout the program. Like many of you, I'm sure, we use a lot of case study assignments in the program. And in almost every single one of those assignments, the students are asked to interpret assessment results and then to make instructional decisions based on those results. So those instructional decisions are either or both. They are what objective should you work on with this student, or what IEP goal would you create for the student? And then what strategy would you use to teach according to that objective or that IEP goal? So database decisions are embedded really throughout our courses. All right, so I'd like you to take just a moment for reflection and think back on those situations that you wrote about or thought about at the beginning of this presentation. And what I'd like you to consider is, if it was the good situation, or maybe even the bad, the not so good situation, how was the situation reflective of one of the assessment HLPs? And on the flip side, how would implementation of one of these assessment HLPs have improved the situation, even if it was what you consider a good example of using assessment? There's always room for improvement, right? How could you implement one of those 3 assessment HLPs to make the situation better? Just think about that. You can pause the video if you want to actually write a reflection. All right. So the discussion questions that are up on EdWeb are these 4 questions. A couple of them are similar to the week 1 questions. Where in your program or in your courses is assessment taught? Okay, where is it already embedded? Number 2, how are teacher candidates given opportunities to practice and reflect on their assessment skills? What do those look like? Or what could they look like? Number 3, what are the benefits of including student voice when developing learner profiles? How do you support or prepare teacher candidates in collecting information from students? Number 4, how are the assessment HLPs highly reliant upon successful implementation of the collaboration HLPs? Okay, you don't have to respond to all 4 of these prompts. Respond to at least 2. If you'd like to respond to more, feel free to, but don't feel obligated. Okay, and of course, you want to respond to a couple of classmates. Okay, so what's next? You want to read the section on assessment. Sorry, I should have gotten rid of that introduction. Well, it is the introduction. The introduction and section on assessment, starting on page 55 is the introduction. It's a couple of pages. And then there are the HLP 4, 5, and 6 chapters. Respond to at least 2 prompts, the prompts I just showed you. Respond to at least 2 of those in EdWeb. Comment on at least 2 other participants' responses, all right? Add resources to the resource folder if you've got them. And then be ready for the next module to open up on Monday, September 12th. All right, thank you so much. Again, looking forward to spending this week with you.